I'm Michael Nelson. I work for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., but that's actually my 8th dream job. And you can read the bio on the website to find out what my other 7 dream jobs have been. I've had 35 years of working on internet policy as a technologist and a physicist, not as a lawyer. My other 3 panelists are people with much few years in the business, but much more impressive resumes. And I'm not going to read their resumes either, because I want to get on to hearing what they have to say. We have the websites. You can learn more from that. We're here to talk about technological disruptions. So half of what we're going to talk about is completely unknown. We don't know what technologies will develop. We don't know how they're going to be used. And we certainly don't know all the second and third order implications, all the follow-on effects. Just as we didn't know that Craigslist was going to destroy half of the revenue from local newspapers by destroying the want ad business. But we're going to speculate. We're going to talk about some of the great things that could happen. I'm a technological optimist, so I'm going to ask some questions that make sure we look at the good side as well as some of the things we've already heard, some of the more scary implications. We're also going to make sure that this is a fast-moving, back-and-forth conversation. These are not 3 keynote speeches. This is going to be questions and answers, debate, and we're going to make time to hear questions from you. So I'm going to ask each of my panelists to give us a sense of who they are, why they're excited about the future, and talk a little bit about what they hope could happen. And I'm going to start by turning to Athan Stephanopoulos. He's a serial entrepreneur. He's also now advising a bunch of startups on the intersection between media and artificial intelligence. So over to you.
Thank you, Michael. And obviously we're going a little out of order, but good afternoon. And as Michael said, hopefully we can keep you awake in kind of the post-lunch slumber. As Michael said, my name is Athan Stephanopoulos. I'm a digital media executive who, for the vast majority of my career, I've really sat at the intersection of media and technology. And early on, I started a company that in many ways doesn't seem so profound now, but you go back into the early 2000s, we were introducing the delivery of video, and particularly short-form video, online, and particularly on social platforms like Facebook and Twitter, before you could just natively post a video. We subsequently brought that company and the technology of it together with a startup at the time that now many of you may have heard of called Now This. And so for about 10 years, I ran Now This News, which was one of the fastest growing digital news platforms in the world in terms of, we learned a lot about the algorithms because we took a very different model, and because we had no legacy business to protect, we went directly to where consumers and audiences were and still to a certain degree are, and that's on social platforms. And so instead of trying to drive them to traditional models of a linear television network or even a print newspaper, we were bringing news content in the form of video natively to these feeds. We ended up selling that, and then I subsequently went over to CNN, where until recently was the chief digital officer of CNN Worldwide, overseeing the full digital operation of the organization globally. And that meant any digital product and essentially everything you consumed or saw or see that is not the linear television news experience. So with that as a backdrop, I mean, for me, as we were talking a little bit about all this, it's hard to talk about where we're going without taking just a quick, reflection on where we've been and how we got here. And when we look at it through the news lens, I mean, I think this room needs no introduction that we now live in an environment where our political discourse is more divisive than it's ever been. We have, quite frankly, because of the algorithm. You've heard in many of the other panels earlier today, John Avalon, who was talking about algorithm regulation from a lens of the kind of political side. But the reality is these algorithms were created in many ways to focus on what we call the attention based economy. We are in the business, particularly if you're trying to reach audiences who are consuming on their mobile devices, in the business of stopping your thumb from swiping up, from tapping and scrolling. And more often than not, it is the content, because of the way these algorithms have been created, is that the most extreme content is obviously the stuff that gets the furthest distribution. Meaning if you like it or you comment it or you share it, it invokes frustration or anger. The algorithm, in a very kind of platonic way, looks at it and says, that's good content. So we will push it further into people's feeds and more people will see it. And obviously there's a tremendous amount of good that comes from that. In some ways, again, to the earlier conversations, it's democratized news and information. You don't have to, Jessica said it in her panel, gone are the days when it was only 3 white men on the 3 broadcast news channels that gave you the news of the day. Now anybody can essentially be their own content creator. But on the opposite side, we also face the double-edged sword. And these algorithms have ultimately created what many are aware of now, these information bubbles. They just simply reinforce our predisposed beliefs. And more often than not, that leads into moments of crisis because we get into our own little tribes. And it culminates in events as I think as tragic and as pronounced as what we saw on January 6th. And so we are now facing a media ecosystem and media environment, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit. You're not going to go through a conversation about technology and technology disruption, particularly today, without talking about AI. But before we can get to AI, the reality is we have to look at the lens of what's happened, and that is more and more people are consuming content on these social platforms, but it's also disrupted even the economic models of news organizations, because that's where audiences are, it's where they're spending time. And yet the economic and business side of the media industry is not there, meaning you're trying to make money off of somebody else's platform. And so big tech has benefited from this behavior of letting other publishers and other content creators put content on their platform that they are essentially monetizing more to their benefit than the publisher. And yet the core legacy business models are under threat, diminishing audiences, diminishing revenue. So you're at this crossroads. And that crossroads is coming at a moment in time where we're now also seeing, and where I would say we're at a new intersection, and that is the entrance of AI and what that will ultimately bring. But to me, before passing on to my fellow panelists, is it's understanding that big tech has, in many ways, in talking about the disruption that they've created in the moment that we're at, much of the challenges that's facing the media industry, and kind of to a more specific degree, the news industry, in terms of where people are finding their information and whether or not it's true or it's propagating misinformation as much as it is propagating correct information. But we have to look at that through the lens of now where are we going, because with AI, it's going to essentially be what we've seen historically, but on steroids. And we'll get to it, but you can look at it through a lens of more problems or where's the opportunities that rest within it.
Oh, thank you very much, and thanks for keeping it brief and yet deep. Next, I'm going to turn to Dhanaraj Thakur. He's with the Center for Democracy and Technology, and he's also in Washington, D.C. And just a little disclosure, I was on the advisory committee for CDT for more than 10 years. I think you're doing amazing work, and I've been benefiting from your work since the 1990s. So how does the world look? How did we get here? And who are you?
Great, thank you, Mike. He just now told me this, by the way. I didn't know that. This news about being on the advisory committee. But yes, so I'm Dhanaraj Thakur. Thanks again for the organizers for this invitation to participate in this panel. I am the research director at the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy group based in Washington, D.C. We also have an office in Brussels. So we primarily focus on tech policy in the U.S. at federal level and at the EU level. And by tech policy, I mean we focus on issues around the intersection of civil and human rights and technology. So that includes things like surveillance, privacy, content moderation, the implications of AI, which we're going to talk about more, and things like AI governance. So to follow on what Athan said, I thought I might start by diving into the weeds a bit about disruption and maybe stepping back. So the thing I want to start with is to think about AI, and specifically generative AI and large language models. And if you think about the way social media companies and most platforms operate, not just now, but in their short history, last 10 years or whatever, they often rely on various forms of automated content analysis, because literally we have billions and billions of user generated content posts being uploaded every day. So given that scale, there has always been some form of automation involved. Now with generative AI and things like large language models, there are already attempts to incorporate these kinds of newer, more advanced AI tools into the content moderation process. I think many of us are familiar with ChatGPT and things like that, and the ability of those tools to analyze posts and content. What is something that we have been working on at CT and want to, I was trying to raise, particularly with various kinds of audiences, whether it's journalists, policymakers, and others, is the application of those LLMs to non-English languages, and specifically what's called low-resource languages. So in the world of large language models, different languages have different resource levels depending on how much data is available in that language. So languages like English are often considered very high resource because the vast majority of what's on the internet is in English, and that's for historical, colonial, and other contemporary reasons. But there are many other languages where there's very little data available, even if there are many speakers, and I mean many by millions of speakers today who are proficient or fluent in those languages. So the implication then is that we end up with certain kinds of problems, inaccuracies, potential bias, potential chilling effects, and limits on free expression when we have the application of these models that are applied to what's called low-resource languages. So a low-resource language can include, for example, language dialects of Arabic, Swahili, which is spoken across East Africa, Tamil, which is spoken like by 40 or 50 million people in India, and Quechua is spoken by millions of people in South America. These are languages spoken by many people, but the application of these LLMs to these languages on social media platforms can lead to several kinds of problems. And we are researching this right now. We're already coming across many of the challenges that users, speakers of those languages face. And so that's the one thing I want to highlight in terms of considering, the pros and cons of how these tools may be used. I think many of us use ChatGPT and it has captured the public's imagination in the sense of how magical it can be and how human-like it can appear. But think about these other cases. And then the second point, the more larger point I want to touch on here relates to how we think about these impacts, the use of these kinds of tools on democratic participation and representation specifically. And here I'm thinking about the problem of disinformation and how these same tools, LLMs, can be used to generate those forms of mis and disinformation, particularly targeted at different communities. So in the United States, there's been a history of voter suppression often targeted at communities of color. The use of these tools, particularly in terms of using mis and disinformation to further suppress votes, is similarly patterned in that way. There have been experiments to show that ChatGPT-3, so the previous version of ChatGPT-3, could be used to generate text aimed at certain communities, African Americans, Jewish Americans, and others, to suppress votes. But going further, one of the larger problems we have within at federal level and even so at the state level is a underrepresentation of certain communities like women of color. In our own study that was done 2 years ago, looking at mis and disinformation targeted at political candidates, women of color political candidates that were running for Congress were twice as likely to be subject to mis and disinformation compared to other candidates, and 4 times as likely to be subject to abuse. With the rise of deepfakes and coming back to Gen AI, there could be a continuation of that threat, which could be even exacerbated now. We don't have as many examples just yet because we're in the midst of this process right now, but this is a cause for concern. So I just wanted to raise those 2 points, somewhat problematic, but we can talk later about how to address them.
And thanks for keeping it to 3 minutes. And now we turn to Ana Paula Valacco, coming to us from Argentina. And like many people her age, she's got 3 or 4 jobs at the same time. And she's going to give us...
it's all about the world of journalism as well. Okay, yeah, my name is Ana Paula. First of all, thank you for having me, and specifically bringing also the voice of Argentina, the Global South, and so many media organizations that are doing their best to bring more democracy to our societies that sometimes they are in danger. But yes, I'm basically coming here as the community manager of JournalismAI. JournalismAI is an initiative that was born 5 years ago at the London School of Economics in London, of course, with the support of the Google News Initiative, trying to understand what was going on with AI in journalism, how journalists were using AI. And at that point in 2019, we did the first research trying to understand, first of all, the needs they had, but the opportunities and fears that were appearing at that time. I am also the director of Project Oasis Global at Sembra Media, which is an organization that basically supports media entrepreneurs and independent journalists to develop sustainable business models, and with the big, as big as sustainable can be understood, of course. But I have a background, a very diverse background as well, because I worked at Google marketing. And so basically, I was part of the other side, selling ads. Then I said, no, let's do the good thing. And then I went to work at a fact-checking organization, Chequeado, which was pretty much the first one in Spanish working on AI, that developed the first tools in Spanish and in a language that was other than English to enhance their work. And what this path has taught me, and what I see now working from JournalismAI, that is a terrific platform for journalists around the world to come and discuss AI and to understand how it can empower their work, is that journalists are facing a lot of things, and AI right now can be a huge tool to help them overcome some challenges, as well as a way perhaps that they can also, as we say in Spanish, shoot their own foot. It's like sometimes if they are not applying it strategically. So that's something that we have seen in our research, and what we have done during the years, like for example, with our fellowship, the Academy for Small Newsrooms, and working closely with newsrooms, is how AI, if strategically and responsibly applied, can be a powerful enhancer or empower their work. Right now, journalism, that's something that I also, it's part of one of my main points. What I do now is that journalism is facing so many challenges. It's not only AI, it's the audiences that don't trust us. It's also AI that may replace us. It's also that the business of journalism is completely undermined by something that we have already done. How we went to ads as a way to finance our work. And then disinformation and misinformation that was clearly that pointed out that, right now we are also working to verify things that we haven't created, and sometimes even us being the ones spreading it with no purpose. But, well, in many ways, I think that this is a great moment for journalism to discuss these topics, to kind of get to a common conversation, and to bring ethics back in the table, and what we are working for. When we, for example, in the morning, it was discussed what is journalism at the end of the day, and what is the job that we do, and why we are doing this. Okay, well, with this, that we know that it's happening, it's not that something that we can just close our eyes and say, no, AI is not here, I will not work with it, it's not affecting my job. It is. sadly or fortunately, however you look at it, it's part of the game. So basically, how are we going to deal with it? And there's a huge question on how, for example, what's going to be our ethical protocols or our ethical principles guiding us in this journey. Are we involving audiences in that process? Are we understanding what they want from us, what they need, what they believe that we can do or we can't? I mean, there's something that's going on there. I would like to discuss also with you. And also this big and huge question is about, okay, yes, a lot of times we are talking about what happens with AI in those big and beautiful media organizations that kind of inspire us all and bring what journalism can be. But what happens in the reality with the news organizations working in those countries that their situation is far from democratic? We've talked about Greece. I can bring the voice from Argentina that we've also we just like went down from 40 from the 40th place to the 66 just in 1 year. So you can imagine the situation is being bad.
Not a good trend.
Yeah. So basically, how can we understand that AI or like these technologies or like these conversations are all being held from the north or like from the very privileged spots, and perhaps and saying, okay, yes, you can also apply that, and then you go and you turn around, and those news organizations are suffering from a lot of things, from government persecution, from the lack of infrastructure, from lack of tools, or because the technology is not prepared, or like it doesn't work the same way in our languages than others. So this is like a big panorama of a lot of things, but I'm happy to discuss them here with you.
Athan, you have a quick interjection?
Yeah, no, I just had a thought as a follow-up, because I think Paula brings up a very important point, and that is trust in news organizations as a whole, and even in journalists, is at the lowest it's ever been. News consumption is at the lowest it's ever been. There's a real thing called news avoidance. And we have to ask ourselves, what's been driving that? And again, we're looking at the fact of the role that these social platforms have played in pushing out so much information, more often than not, misinformation, that is partially what creates that fear and that lack of trust in news and in news organizations. And that is even before AI has really entered kind of the doorstep of the industry. But there's one other really important point is that, well, who controls the algorithms? Who developed them? It's big tech. And now who has control of AI and the future of AI? The data itself, the cost of compute, big tech. So the same parties are still at play here, in that the big tech firms, who in many ways were the perpetrators of where we're seeing the media and news environment today, are going to play a very intimate and important role as we think about the future of media in terms of what this new technology is going to mean. And people look at it through a lens of fear, but now I think there's opportunity.
Let me pick up on your comment about news consumption and ask a very specific question. It's a two-part question. You can answer the first one in about 10 seconds, and then try to answer the second part in less than a minute. I'm a physicist. I like numbers. Let's imagine 5 years into the future. Put on your futurist hat. Tell me how the amount of time that the average person, maybe the average person in this audience, will spend looking for and consuming news. Will it go up because there's more rich content? Will it go down because the news is so hard to find and so untrustworthy? So I'm just going to go down the line. Dhanaraj first, Athan, Anna Paula, and then you get 1 minute to explain your answer.
Okay, I can take a shot at this, but I'm actually more interested in hearing what they have to say. But I could say it depends. But
Are you an economist?
I think the nature of the consumption of news is evolving, and so there's a lot around absorbing more like video-based content, short content, things like that. And so if you're thinking of, when you say how do people consume news, how much time they spend on it, if it's like reading some headlines in a newspaper, I think less, much less. But if it's like news as presented in different ways, maybe through video content or the stuff that I guess Athan has been working on for a while, that might increase. But people might not view that as news the way we are thinking of news now. And that So it's about like shifting definitions or perceptions of what is news, and I think people may actually spend a lot of time on that if the content, if it relates to them, and they might not even think of it as news, but it could be information coming from influencers or others who may, have partnerships with like news companies and others, and that might be the trend, I think.
Well, as somebody who worked on legislation, I should have known I should define my terms like news. Athan, what's your answer? What's the number?
I'll follow the rules. I'll stay within 10 seconds. I think at least for the consumption, it'll be the same or less.
And why?
Because to me, time is a finite thing, and the reality is everybody allocates their time. I'll give you an example in terms of some data. Right now, at least in the US, 90% of all digital consumers who spend time online consume news at least once a month. But of that time that they spend, only 4% of it is dedicated to news. Meaning that you're competing for people's time and attention across a litany, as you pointed out, of other things. What do they define as news, information, entertainment, sports, all sorts of stuff. So I think it's less about will they do more or less, but rather how they get it. And hopefully in the future, they feel more trust because AI hopefully can actually help validate with more veracity that is trustworthy content or that's been verified, that it does not contain misinformation, that's not synthetic media, that helps them probably consume a larger array but in a faster, more efficient process.
So Anna Paula, what's your number?
No, I think I agree with Athan. I mean, right now, with the news avoidance, like the active news avoidance that people are trying to say, because basically they say news are terrible. I don't want to hear them. I just want to. The thing also that will change a lot, and that is changing, is how we consume news. Perhaps there's going to be a lot of more incidental consumption of news, because we may run across news in different platforms and different ways. For example, like now, but we will. And I see audiences, if this will be like, if this continues to be like it is today, I hope there is a new conversation and we improve our products and that kind of things. But if not, people will keep avoiding the news. I mean, last year's report of the Reuters Institute said that only one in five would go to the news website to search for news or to read the news. And I think, I mean, the next edition is going to be launched in a month. I think that it's going to be much less this year, and especially when all the news, I mean, going around the world, that the kind of news that goes around, they are like more terrible, sadder, and less optimistic in many ways. If we don't change the way we have that kind of conversations with our audiences, yes, it's going to be less.
Okay, so we're going to reconvene in 5 years and figure out what really happened. Let me finish with the last of my questions. I just asked you a two-part question. This time I'm going to ask you 3 questions and you get to pick one. So we're talking technology disruptions. I want to know how you would do the following. How would you fix the internet, or fix television, or improve radio? It doesn't have to be a technology. It could be a new business model. It could be a new business practice. But if you had your way, what innovation would you like to see in the next 2 or 3 years? And it could be a little innovation. It's CNN and Fox News innovated by putting another extra line of text across the screen. And that changed how people watched news. It actually kept them more engaged, because if they got bored with what they were hearing, they started reading the bottom. So what would you do to make the internet or television or radio, which all are doing damage to democracy in various ways, what would you do to make those media work better for the user and for society? Simple question. 45 seconds.
Very simple question. I mean, like, I think that anyone here could just propose themselves, right? Now, I don't
And the
agree.
audience can tweet their answer too.
Yeah.
So just put it out there.
You'll just have a couple of minutes more than I. So basically, I don't think that they are all bad to democracy. So just to start, I mean, like, the thing is, yes, it's that in many ways, the business model, for example, of internet and the platforms and TV and radio has pushed us, like, I mean, basically, I think that news industry has had little power or like possibilities to step up and say, hey, these are the kind of things that we need to do, or like even made some very bad decisions now that we can see it 10 years later. But if I think of innovation that has to do with the internet, it would be more like kind of thinking what ways we can democratize the business model, or how money can be like distributed among actors and publishers. I mean, just in a way to create more space for accountability, or for like different things, and to improve what's going on with over there with information. And but basically, all of this would be more audience oriented, like kind of making decisions with the audience, like prioritizing them audiences.
So this would be a little bit like Substack and Patreon and what Elon Musk is trying to do on Twitter, so that people pay to follow people, or is it something even better than that?
But perhaps it can be. It doesn't have to be money. Perhaps it can be like a token, like something like that. We can. I mean, at the moment of thinking, it's like, how can we improve the way in which we endorse products? I don't know. I'm just like thinking out loud. I mean, but yeah.
Make more people influencers or producers. Okay.
Yeah, more like kind of.
Athan.
Everybody will be a producer when they have access to AI and, create high quality content that is as professional as any media company, news organization. But to your questions, I think to the two latter ones, I'll even answer them quickly. I personally don't think, and I probably take a very extreme view, even coming from an organization that has almost 40 years of a legacy linear product, I don't think there's any experience or product you can introduce to change the trajectory of where linear television or radio is going. The reality is, earlier this morning, we had a room full of young kids. They simply are growing up in a world where they don't go and watch television. They don't open up a newspaper, and you're not going to put that genie back in the bottle. So I think there's a new product that will ultimately evolve that we don't even know of yet, that will, again, kind of like TikTok was just a few years ago, something new that becomes a new medium with which people consume. But to your question about what can happen on the internet to change its future and so forth, to me, it comes to Section 230. And Section 230 is a U.S. code as part of the Communications Act. And the reality is this code has given immunity to big tech on not being considered a publisher on anything that's put onto these platforms. So if you put, extreme information up on Facebook or Twitter or any of the other platforms, that's just considered free speech. And so what I mean by that is that Congress has been debating, do we put regulation around? Do we, strip 230? Do we keep it? What happens? I think even just the mere conversation of talking about what Section 230 really means is going to force a lot of big tech to get to a place of self-regulation. And I'll use an example here. Is pre-internet, media companies, the film industry, the gaming industry, and even broadcast television did self-regulation before they had fear of government coming in and put regulation. And so they put self-imposed rating systems. So we had to tell audiences what the ratings of our films or of games. And I think that particularly with AI, big tech will be better served if they get to a place where they self-regulate the deployment and use of AI, how it can be used, and kind of set rules of the road that, again, hopefully restrict what we saw in the first kind of iteration of the web in kind of Web 2.0 in these past 10 years. And that is, hey, it's anybody's game. If you're a publisher, put whatever you want up there. As the platforms, we bear no responsibility.
Okay. How to improve the media?
So I was thinking of mine of a reaction to what Athan just said, but maybe
I was thinking that too, so we'll get there.
But maybe I'll go back to your question. So I think this was mentioned in a previous panel, and I just mentioned around the business model. I think this is the crux of the problem right now, which is we have a hyper-targeted business model where companies, social media, but not just social media, like all the apps on your phone collecting data about you. There's an entire industry of data brokers in the US and outside US, in fact, that have detailed profiles of all of us. And these profiles are available for sale to anyone. For example, the government of China. So this argument about China going through TikTok is really redundant because they can already do this. That problem, this hyper-targeted problem, which leads to like the whole online ad business model, the data broker problem, can be addressed through having a federal privacy law in the US, which we do not have, which is why there's this free-for-all. And having a privacy law will then rein in what these big tech companies are doing with regard to targeted ads, and also some of the harms that you're mentioning, which come in, which you, I think you're linking to Section 230. So what we need then is that federal privacy law. It's been stuck. There are attempts in the past, and they've been undermined. And there's one that's kind of close now and imperfect, but still potentially good enough law. APRA, which is currently in Congress. That, I think, is one solution, not necessarily innovation in the sense that you're talking about, but given that we have no sense of rights to privacy right now in the US with regard to us, at least if we're not in states like California or elsewhere, we're kind of stuck. And so having that would go a long way. So
we got regulatory innovation, business model innovation, and a little bit of innovation around norms. I still hope we do get a little more technology innovation, but we have a hard time predicting what that could be. Now we're going to turn to a little bit of back and forth and a little bit of discussion among the panelists. I have to say, though, congratulations. My goal here on this panel was to be half as interesting as the 20 minutes we spent beforehand in the green room. We have overachieved. This is even more interesting. The rules now are you get to ask questions of each other or of me. One question, one topic. The more provocative, the better. I think I know what Dhanaraj is going to ask first.
Okay.
Because if you don't ask it, I'm going to ask it.
Well,
Both
sure.
looking at me.
Because of the Section 230. But maybe I'll leave that to you. And what I did want to ask was raise a point that's interesting, but I think both of you raised this issue around trust. And we have the ability now, and we'll have a lot more potential for many people to generate very believable, realistic-looking content for many different purposes. And so this issue of trust comes into play. One study that comes to mind, and this is still like early research, and I'm trying to understand people's ability to discern between generated AI content and not. And to do that, the industry is developing like what they call watermarks. So these kinds of labels that they'll put on content that's produced by a generative AI model. That study actually showed, I'm thinking this is a study done by University of Washington, it actually showed that it created more confusion, because now if someone looks at this thing and they see a watermark, they say, okay, but if they don't see a watermark, they're not sure. And instead of solving the problem of trust, it's actually creating more confusion. So I guess my question is like, given that these technological innovations, are there other ways to get to this trust problem, particularly around generative AI content?
Look, I think it's a good question, and it's the challenge that everybody's going to face, because yes, you're introducing something new, like a watermark. I mean, you can use the example of like how Twitter created a blue check that, and it's a verified account versus not. There's going to be a period of adoption. And you can argue, does it add more problems? Maybe more problems in the short term, but does it help create over the long term a bit of more clarity to say, yeah, now I understand that mark means I'm looking at something that essentially contains synthetic media. In some way, this has been manipulated, and at the least, now I know that. It's going to be hard, because who's going to own that? Where does the trust come from? Is the verification coming from Google? Like, who's the independent party that we ultimately all say, okay, if it has that mark and that digital watermark, I therefore know that is verified, factual information. That is going to be a big leap for the consumer side, because right now we all are a victim to it. You can see something in your feed, and even if you don't know where it comes from, more often than not, you're like, oh, I read that, and then you tell somebody, did you know that? That is disinformation that gets put into the system, and then we propagate as just individuals misinformation. And so I want to add one last comment as it relates to, I feel like we got to talk about the sliver of hope. And this is where I think, to your question, is I in some ways believe that AI can, and in some ways hopefully, be, as much as it will probably, be used by bad actors to try to manipulate and create more of that information. But because of AI's power and the compute capability, is that it's going to be able to really identify things faster and at scale to hopefully solve that very thing you just talked about. And is that digital watermark, that verification, that over time consumers start to say, I know what's real and what's not.
Anna Paula, what do the Argentines trust online, if anything?
I mean, because I just wanted to ask and to add a little bit of, to that, because something that happened precisely with Twitter is that the blue mark then became just the same mark that premium users will have. I mean, those that pay. So that thing that was kind of taught to our audience, to the audience, and say, okay, if you see a blue mark, then it's verified. Now it's not, and it's just because those marks or those blue stamps or whatever, they are controlled by actors that are not held accountable. I mean, like they don't. Now we have the people that are building generative AI and that are working towards general artificial intelligence and everything, saying that they don't need to be controlled. I mean, they will do the sacrifice to go beyond what they thought that they could do. So, well, going back, yeah, I think that in that sense, how can we still create kind of decentralized, perhaps, or like kind of more like the dream of blockchain, like how could we create something that is more like endorsed and backed by the community instead of certain specific actors?
I'm just going to build one, because Anna Paula made a very important point using Twitter as that example. People trusted that. It takes a lot of work to build trust. It takes very little to lose it. And Elon Musk comes in and says, I'm going to take it off, and now you got to pay me to get that blue mark. And guess what? I can go act like I'm anybody now. So the same thing for AI. Who's that verified party that everybody says collectively that I trust that?
Never has one man destroyed so much trust of so many people in so many different ways. I have a question for the audience. We had an impassioned plea to fix Section 230. How many people in the audience have read Jeff Koseff's book, The 26 Words That Made the Internet? If you care about this issue, it is the essential reading. It's not an unbiased take, but it is an incredibly important book about a very hot topic. I'm a little biased. I helped write that language when we reformed the Telecom Act when I was in the White House. It's also much more nuanced than the debate we're hearing on the Hill. I do hope that we solve some of the problems with it, which are not with the 26 words. It's with a bunch of judges who took the words, which say very clearly, we will not hold the platforms responsible for the billions of words that millions of users write every day. And they interpreted that to mean the platforms can do whatever they want. And that's the problem, is they went from words to actions. And so websites were actually doing fraudulent, discriminatory, illegal things and using Section 230 to get out of that. I mean, Section 230 really is just a streamlined version of the First Amendment. But it's broken in that it's being interpreted the wrong way. Sorry to intervene, but this is in the top 3 of the issues I care passionately about. I promised questions from the audience. We have 6 minutes. Actually, we have 5 minutes and 52 seconds. I hope someone has good questions, and I hope they can keep them brief and have a question mark at the end of their comment. We have a microphone to go around. Where do I... Where I'm okay.
Thank you.
In back. Are you a technologist, by the way?
Not a technologist, no.
Okay.
My question is, what have we learned from the past 20 years of digital policy and media? And do you think that that's going to help us with the next 20 years? Like, have we learned the lessons of our mistakes, given all of the challenges that lie ahead of us?
Is that a yes/no question? No. Okay.
I mean, that's sorry. Did
Why
you
don't you start first? Okay.
quickly for me? I mean, what I hope, particularly big tech, has learned is that in many ways they benefited in the past 20 years. But if we take the moment we're at right now with AI and what drives the value of AI, it's data, it's good data, it's quality. I mean, in many ways, all these LLMs and all the tech companies that are building these large language models are using the factual based information from a whole host of news organizations and media. And so what I hope they learn is that there is a symbiotic relationship between high quality content and the future of high quality LLMs, because LLMs need to continually be trained. And so if in many ways the media ecosystem fully collapses just in the pure economics of it, I think they ultimately hurt themselves. Right? It's the tragedy of the commons that they're so selfish in the short term that they're going to end up destroying the environment that built their success in the long term. So that's my hope for big tech.
Paula?
Yeah, I think that it has to go in that way. I mean, like how. I mean, I'm not an expert in internet policy, but I've lived through it because basically I'm one of that generation that basically was born with the internet a little bit. I'm not saying I'm younger, but yeah. No, but basically, yes, there is this need of to find ways in which these platforms can be held accountable. I mean, and the previous like two panels before, when they started to discuss, I mean, how the lack of regulations have in many ways helped them to become super powerful and super influential in what's going on around the world. I mean, there is a conversation that has to be. I mean, it has to take place, and somehow. And I think that these past 20 years have taught us that sometimes the ones that are making those decisions are perhaps not making the greatest decisions of all, and in which ways those decisions can be questioned.
Dhanaraj?
I think one of the things we have learned is that we have yet to get real insight into how these major big tech companies work and what kinds of impact their services have on users like us. So, for example, when Instagram says they're going to change some feature on their platform to mitigate this problem of like negative mental health impacts on young people, and they add certain features, and they say their studies show that it can have a beneficial impact. We, as independent researchers, and here I'm talking as a researcher, we have no way of verifying that because we do not have access as researchers to data within those companies. There's the same thing like when WhatsApp says we'll add this check mark to show this particular content has been forwarded too many times, and so that might help people stop forwarding. But we as independent researchers, again, have no way to really understand those impacts. Generally, researchers outside of industry, outside of these companies, do not have access to data within the companies to understand and explore and come up with ideas and solutions. This lack of researchers that access to data is a big problem. It's the same problem that's going to happen now with these generative AI companies, because we can speculate about impacts and use cases, but we actually don't know how people use these. I don't know what kinds of prompts people are entering into ChatGPT and what are the trends. That's something we learned with social media, and it remains a problem with these generative AI companies. And there are legislative solutions to try and address this, but they haven't gone as far as we'd like.
We have 1 minute left, and I will provide some wrap-up comments in answer to your question. I mentioned I've been working in this area for 35 years. The big difference over the time I've been involved is that in 1988, there were 5 senators out of 100 who even cared about these issues, but they all studied them deeply. Now we have at least 90 out of 100 senators who want to be involved because they learned the wrong thing. They learned that data and technology equals power and money, and they want some. So we see a lot of rent seeking, we see a lot of policy pursued for political reasons, not because it actually helps citizens. I'm being incredibly cynical here, but I'm providing you with the wisdom of 35 years. It's even worse in Brussels right now. They promise you great things and they provide the wrong solution. So the most important thing we learned is that the more options, the more things that users have to do with this technology, the more choices we have, the better off for society. Tune in tomorrow. We've got some very good keynotes that also try to paint a picture of where we can be. And thanks for a great question. I wish we'd had time for more. And thank you for an amazingly useful and very concise series of answers.